YOLO Composing Gloves here, and today we're going to be talking about what is counterpoint. Counterpoint is the art of writing multiple lines together that are independent and sound cool by themselves. And when you put them together, they produce a musical effect. So let me go ahead and play for you a short example. Here we go. So there's a bunch of sort of guidelines, rules, I guess you could say, to produce certain types of effects. And let's go ahead and say, where did this counterpoint stuff come from? That might be a question you have. Like, that's kind of a weird sentence, but where did this counterpoint stuff come from? Why is it called counterpoint in the first place? Well, it's called counterpoint because back in the day, before we had notes, right, we needed a way to write this stuff down. So we'd write them down using points, or at least points became popular. Like, points became the thing you use because there was actually a bunch of different attempts, and you can go into the history books and look at all the different systems people came up with. But points became a pretty standard thing. And so now with our points, we wanted to write down melodies. And the first melody you wrote down, or not necessarily the first, but you would write down a melody, and that would be called the cantus firmus, which is Latin for fixed voice. So you write down something, and this thing is fixed. It's not moving. And then, you write down your second part and your third part and your fourth part. And back in the day, the notion of a chord progression and harmony was not really a thing yet. They thought very differently back in the day. They were really concerned with how things played out horizontally, the progression of intervals that were used. There was a bunch of other stuff that was being considered. And it was really more, if you think about it, kind of a lot more melodic based. And so when you write down your second part, one of the things that, would show your sophistication was to write a part that was independent and sounded good if sung alone. So let's say you got rid of the other parts and all you're left with was that second line. That line would also sound good. And then when you put them together, and if they sounded like something else, but it still sounded good, then, that's like really cool because now you've got two melodies and together they form like a third big melody. And then later on, people started saying, why don't we use these melodies to reveal our chord progression? So here, I've got a chord progression that I'm revealing to you, whether you realize it or not. Your ear is being clued in. You can definitely hear what I'm doing, like, for example, right here. You hear that bong. You can hear a cadence right there. You can hear all kinds of stuff. Like, we have our sus5 very obviously being represented. So now you might go, this isn't that obvious because you might be used to hearing it all in terms of chords. But what we see here is once we reach this stage, some interesting stuff happens. But first, on the counterpoint note in this cantus firmus, I'd like to mention that in your cantus firmus, when you wrote your second and third part, a lot of the times you're just writing like a second part or something, right? Because as you add more, they get more and more complicated. And so as a result, you'll need, and usually you're going to need a simpler cantus firmus to start with. So if you're going to write 5 parts, that's going to get really complicated. So you're going to want to have a really simple idea to start with. And there's forms of composition that really allow you to flex your muscles or your chops, your writing chops, when it comes to counterpoint. Like, for example, a fugue. A fugue has a really specific form and some pretty specific rules. If you're writing, like a fugue, and you're not getting all weird by mixing with other stuff, then you're going to need a really simple subject, which is to say your first idea. Because if you have a complicated subject, once you get to writing your fifth voice, it's going to get really crazy. So there aren't very many five voice fugues, but I just want to say that for your counterpoint, your cantus firmus, it's called counterpoint because if you have a bunch of points that form your cantus firmus, which is your base melody, and then you write another melody where for every point in the first melody, there is a point in your new melody, then we call this the counterpoint, right? You're countering them. And then let's say that for every point in your first melody, you have 2 points in your new melody. Well, then that's going to be called a species of counterpoint. We'll talk about these things as they come up. And the species thing isn't a strict definition. It doesn't always correlate to like, oh, if I have one note, I have 16 notes in my counterpoint. Like, it doesn't work like that. We actually define fourth and fifth species a bit different, but that's the general idea. And so it's really kind of a structured way of breaking down and looking at melodies, and that's why it's called a counterpoint. Now, when we stick to really formal like definitions, like here's a point, here's 2 points for every single note in my cantus firmus, there's exactly 2 notes in my second part that will always correspond to the one note in the other in the cantus firmus. So this, when we follow these really strict rules, we call it strict counterpoint because we're being really strict. As soon as you start breaking rules and getting a little weird, we call that free counterpoint. And that's the kind we're really going to use. And there's a whole school of thought on how to mix these things together. So it's really like just a whole set of tools, and what's really important is it's a viewpoint on how to use these tools. Eventually, though, harmony did get developed, and some people started saying, hey, why don't we use counterpoint instead of exclusively for writing melodies? Why don't we use it to also reveal harmony? And so when that started coming around, that's kind of like what we look at. When you listen to it, when you hear counterpoint used today in more modern songs, that's the kind of counterpoint you're probably listening to. Like this, for example, this has that all over it because I have my chord progression. I'm very clearly defining things as I go along. Counterpoint's also really cool because it's a flip side of looking at harmony. So counterpoint is a viewpoint of harmony after this sort of notion was discovered. Because we've talked about voice leading, and every time we've talked about voice leading, we're pretty much talking about counterpoint. We've mentioned tendency tones, which are a big thing in counterpoint. They're really more of a counterpoint topic. But it's really, counterpoint and harmony share a lot in common. And when you learn one, you're learning really important aspects that will be applied in the other. So for example, you know what a triad is. It's a root, a third, and a fifth. And you also know that the perfect fifth contributes nothing in a major or minor chord because both of them have perfect fifths. So when we're writing a chord, we always want to choose to include the third at least once because that's what defines the chord. We may choose to omit the third simply to remain ambiguous, and that can be really helpful at times too. So when we're writing our counterpoint, if I want you to hear, so you see here I'm going for a 1 major 7 and I'm writing a C major chord, there are 2 notes that are really important for the listener to hear besides the tonic. That is the third, because that defines the chord so they'll know it's a major chord, and the 7, because the 7 is what makes the chord sound like a major 7 chord. And so you can see here I have the third, and it's a longer note, and I have the 7, and it's the longest note. And when we accent a note by making it longer, or we accent a note in time, we call this an agogic accent, and it's one of the methods to make notes sound more important. And so I'm using this so that you kind of know what my intents are. So if I play this line by itself, I convey that chord to you in a really like fast manner in this case. And then my second line is merely to help it out. So here I'm choosing to outline the third, so you're really being hit in the face with that third. And I don't really focus too much on the 7. I really rely on this to convey the 7 sound. And let me go ahead and show you. These 2 lines by themselves are indeed very melodic. They're not necessarily singable. That used to be like, we want to write singable things. But because we're writing for a synthesizer, my melodies are synthesizer singable, okay? Synths can sing them. And you can hear, I tried to really get my chord progression through. You can hear a lot of things. I think almost everything is chord tones. There's a couple of things that aren't, but it's like pretty much all chord tones. And if I play my second line, now you notice the note's missing here, but you see it's being filled in by the other voice. If you're writing out sheet music, both parts would have a note there and they just play a unison. But I omit it because when they play together, it produces an effect. You see how, like, it's because synthesizers, since they're so precise, they're unusually more precise, you know, than if you had two clarinets. The clarinets aren't going to hit each other with the same phase, and they're not going to double in amplitude randomly. Like they'll get louder, but they're not going to do what a synth does. Like a synth changes timbrally when you do that too. So I chose to let the other voice fill it in. So it is a smooth scale. As you can hear, do 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 do. And so as you can see, we have two parts, but when we put them together, you get this notion of something you could hum. You go do 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 do. And what you're actually doing is you're like picking apart the different pieces of each melody that stick out to you at most in time, and you come up with that. So like do 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 is one melody. Like over here, you might go do 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 do. You might sing that instead of the do 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 do, or I sing the wrong note. So that's what's so cool about counterpoint. Your ear can hear so many different things, and they work so nicely together if you follow specific rules, or not rules, but certain, we're gonna call them techniques, because that's what they are. They're just techniques. So for example, one technique is this notion of a scale. Scales are really easy to identify stepwise. So this scale gives us a clear sense of contour. So we have this clear sense of rise, and then we go down. And I also use this in the second part when we achieve our focal point in the second line. We have our nice sense of resolution, and there's a clear sense of climax. It makes for a well-distinguished scale, or a well-distinguished melody. Like, it's really easy to tell, but it's still interesting to the ear. Now, not everything has to be, you know, the stepwise motion. There's another idea where you have like stuff in the middle, like this happens, and then maybe I have notes, but this stepwise motion will be a clue to your ear that there is a shape going on. This is going to be kind of intense. Let's shorten these up. And I'm guessing I'm going for a major chord here. I don't know. Maybe this will sound dumb. Yeah, it did sound dumb. But anyways, what you'll do is, this is actually a really common feature. I'm just not taking the time to write something out. But it's the notion that the steps in between will fill in that missing. It won't fill in. It'll give this sense of the rise. We'll look at a specific example of it that's a little bit better than what I just did. Because it can get quite interesting and produce some really cool effects. So yeah, it's really just, so all the harmony you've learned up until now, you can use that to write this. Like, for example, what I did for this one was I wrote out a chord progression, and then I wrote in my cantus firmus, essentially. I wrote out my first melody, which was this guy. This one. And once I had that, I wrote in basically my counterpoint. Mine's a free counterpoint because I wasn't looking at all these specific rules. I was just looking at creating a second melody that sounded nice and would play nicely with the other one in a way that would produce this harmonic structure. And so I'm using things like, well, I know the tendency tones want to do this. I know I want to maintain this scale figure here. I think that's kind of cool. And to reach a climax, and we have this little leap here. We skipped the leading tone, so it's kind of like, whoa, like we jumped at the last second. We fooled them. We could maybe do this. That could work too, probably. Let's have them both play. See, you could do that. In my case, I didn't like that as much as just this. I thought that sounded nicer. So that is counterpoint in a nutshell. Hopefully you have a good idea. To summarize, it's a way to write multiple melodies at the same time to musical effect. We say to musical effect because it doesn't necessarily have to have a chord progression that goes with it. And that's pretty much what counterpoint is. It's another way of looking at harmony. If you have any questions, let me know. Subscribe and have a blessed day.